Ossett is a quiet market town in the English county of West Yorkshire, hardly a place where homicides, demonic forces, and exorcisms are topics of idle conversation. But in 1974, an otherwise ordinary husband and father committed a crime so heinous that investigators are still haunted by it to this day. And the catalyst behind the crime, I'm sure you'll agree, is extremely strange. The Taylor family lived in the Havercroft district of Ossett. The household was considered joyful and content and consisted of mild-mannered 31-year-old Michael, his wife Christine, their 5 children, and the family dog. Michael was known by neighbors and friends as a devoted and loving father. But under the surface, Michael had experienced a fair share of personal issues. A back injury suffered some years earlier resulted in persistent pain and made finding steady and lasting employment difficult. The lack of stability and his physical limitations also brought about occasional instances of depression. Beyond that, nothing dramatic took place in the home to the best of anyone's knowledge. While not a particularly religious church-going family, as most in Ossett were, a friend named Barbara Wardman felt strongly that Michael needed some spiritual support and introduced him to an assemblage called the Christian Fellowship Group that was led by a young 21-year-old pastor named Marie Robinson. Despite his prior lack of interest in organized religion, Michael became a regular attendee at meetings and became an eager and energetic member of the congregation. He embraced their teachings and became captivated by Pastor Marie. The two would spend so much time together that it bordered on unseemliness. He would join her in sessions where they would employ the power of God to rid people of sins and often would speak in tongues while performing these somewhat ersatz exorcisms. They also spent a great deal of time in private, often staying up all night making the sign of the cross to each other to fend off what Robinson had convinced him was the evil power brought forth by the full moon. Before very long, it was obvious to the congregation that Michael had become smitten with Robinson. The result was a dramatic change in Michael's temperament at home. That is, when he actually was at home between sessions with Pastor Marie. He became argumentative, easily annoyed, and borderline menacing. All who knew him became aware of his dramatic change in character and temperament. His association with the church group seemed to be the only thing anyone could point to as a catalyst for his erratic behavior and some of the peculiar perspectives he now held. But no one was more aware of this than his wife Christine, who by now was convinced her husband had become smitten with Marie Robinson. Having had enough, she confronted Michael publicly in front of a group of people and accused him of being unfaithful to her. Her allegation triggered something even darker in Michael, who felt as though he was being influenced by an evil force. Immediately it became apparent that Marie's teachings and influence over him had been perhaps a bit too effective, as he turned his wrath upon her in front of the entire gathering. He attacked Marie both verbally and physically, to the point where he had to be restrained by other members of the congregation before any severe harm was done. Marie would later give her summation of the attack thusly, perhaps giving some insight into what depths their religious conviction had reached.
I suddenly glanced at Mike and his whole features changed. He looked almost bestial. He kept looking at me and there was a really wild look in his eyes. I started screaming at him out of fear. I started speaking in tongues. Mike also screamed at me in tongues. I was on the verge of death and I seemed to come to my senses. I knew that only the name of Jesus would save me, and I just started saying over and over again, Jesus. When Chris heard me calling on the name of Jesus, she started saying it too, and I believe firmly that it was only by calling on his name that I was not killed.
For his part, Michael would retain no memory of the entire incident, and while he was bestowed forgiveness for the outburst, he would be held under close scrutiny. Meanwhile, his descent into madness continued, and it was clear this was not the same Michael Taylor who first showed up at the doors of the Christian Fellowship Church. So profound was the growing insanity that a number of ministers became involved, and eventually concluded that Michael was in the throes of a demonic possession. The local vicar concurred and gave his support for an exorcism to be performed. Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith were tasked with carrying out the ritual, which was scheduled for October 5, 1974, at St. James Church in Barnsley. The night came and the ritual began in the presence of the Christian Fellowship group. Michael would react to the rites with aggression and hostility, scratching, biting, and convulsing uncontrollably. Crucifixes would be pushed into his mouth, and holy water would be used liberally. Michael continued to lash out, growling at those in close proximity to him. Vincent and Smith would go on to claim that no less than 40 demons infested Michael's body, all exhibiting various sundry and blasphemous qualities. Each was separated from Michael individually, and none were freely willing to depart. The exorcism lasted all night and into the following morning, when the clergy finally succumbed to exhaustion. It was decided the exorcism would be completed the following night. The priests had determined that the three most persistent demonic entities still remained in Michael, representing insanity, anger, and murder. One parishioner, the wife of Reverend Smith, Margaret, claimed that a post-ritual vision came to her from God, that the murderous demon was planning to kill Christine Taylor. Her pleas were ignored, and Michael and Christine were sent home to prepare for the final stages of the deliverance. The next morning, a patrol car making its rounds through Ossett came upon a naked man walking unsteadily in the middle of the street, completely covered in blood. As they approached the man on foot, he laid down and curled up into a fetal position and began screaming over and over, "It is the blood of Satan." A crowd began to gather, and it was clear who this very disturbed and unhinged individual was. It was Michael Taylor. An ambulance was quickly summoned as the officers did their best to calm Michael, who persisted in screaming vagaries about Satan. It continued even as he was taken away to the hospital. Some in the crowd had identified Michael to the policemen and gave them his address, which they immediately sped off to. Police Constable Ian Walker, arriving at the Taylor residence, was somewhat surprised to see a patrol car already there. Neighbors apparently had called him after hearing a disturbance taking place inside that morning. As Walker approached the house, he was stopped in his tracks by the sight of his inspector coming out, bending over and vomiting. When he composed himself, he cautioned the younger officer not to go inside, as what awaited him was nothing the older, veteran officer had ever seen before. Now we're going to stop right here for a minute, because the details of this crime are so graphic and monstrous that YouTube's, as well as my own standards and common decorum, prevent me from including them in this video. But for anyone who cares to venture into the darkest realms of a depraved mind and learn what was discovered at the Taylor home, I'll post a link to it in the comments section, but bear in mind it's not for the faint of heart. For now, back to the video. Michael had by now been taken into police custody and was interviewed only after it was decided he was coherent enough to speak with. He went into detail about his exorcism with Detective Inspector Brian Smith.
It was a long night. They danced around me and burned my cross because that was tainted with the evil. They had me in the church all night. Look at my hands. I was banging on the floor. The power was in me. I couldn't get rid of it, and neither could they. They were too late. I was compelled by a force within me to destroy everything living within the house.
While he claimed not to recall any of his actions, he nonetheless professed his love for his wife, followed by,
Released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed.
Michael was immediately charged with his wife's murder and sent to Broadmoor Hospital for observation while awaiting his trial. His stay at Broadmoor was largely uneventful, as he rarely spoke and spent a great deal of time asleep. The trial itself began in March of 1975, and as expected, with a case involving a heinous crime and demonic possession, it created a media sensation. Jurors were warned by prosecutor Jeffrey Baker that some of what they were about to hear and see would test even the most stoic among them. There was little doubt Michael had experienced a severe psychotic break, and his difficulty in recalling anything that took place was confounding. He professed his love for his wife and insisted he acted under the influence of diabolical forces, suspecting her of also being under their control. His defense counsel, Harry Ognall, laid much of the blame for his actions on the Christian Fellowship congregation, as well as the clergy who carried out the exorcism. The church group was painted more in the light of a cult than a religious assembly, and had exacerbated Michael's pre-existing psychological issues by employing powerful forms of suggestion and ultimately mind control. He described them as neurotics feeding neurosis to a neurotic. As far as the exorcism and those who performed it, it too had taken a toll on Michael's fragile state of mind. Coupled with the teachings of the prayer group, it spun Michael into a state of insanity, which ultimately resulted in murder. Ognall was especially harsh on them, and unabashedly so, stating at one point,
I am aware that it is generally regarded as improper for an advocate to express any personal feeling or opinion about the case in which he is engaged. I am afraid I find it quite impossible to observe such constraints in this case. Let those who truly are responsible for this killing stand up. We submit that Taylor is a mere cipher. The real guilt lies elsewhere. Religion is the key. Those who have been referred to in evidence, and those clerics in particular, should be with him in spirit now in this building, and each day he is incarcerated in Broadmoor, and not least on the day he must endure the bitter reunion with his 5 motherless children.
Michael Taylor was found not guilty of his wife Christine's murder by reason of insanity. Having been declared both clinically and legally insane, he was remanded to Broadmoor Secure Hospital for a 2-year term, then another 2-year sentence at Bradford Royal Infirmary. Upon completion of those sentences, he was deemed not to be a further threat to himself or the public and was released. He returned to Ossett, where one might assume he was less than welcome after the horror he perpetrated years earlier. Depression and peculiar conduct remained a glaring part of his makeup, and Michael made no less than 4 attempts at taking his own life, once jumping from a bridge, which resulted in severe injuries to his back and legs. Things went quiet with him for a few years after that. Then in July of 2005, he was arrested for harassment and inappropriate conduct with an underage female. Michael took full responsibility for his own actions and then asked if he was going back to Broadmoor for killing his wife. During a week spent in custody for the sexual battery charge, the psychological problems exhibited 30 years prior seemed apparent once again. Upon his release, they actually seemed to dissipate. He was deemed to be at a lower risk of committing another crime and received but a 3-year stretch of community service and was required to undergo continued psychiatric management. As for the participants of the exorcism, there was public outcry to the point no further rituals were performed by the Anglican Church. But to the point where responsibility was fully taken, there was something left to be desired. Chief Anglican priest Father Peter Vincent maintained that Michael Taylor was absolutely possessed by demonic entities and suffered no consequence for his own actions, saying God would bring good out of it in his own way. Reverend Peter Vincent was a bit more contrite and self-aware, insisting he would still come to the aid of those who need him, but conceded he is but a human being with human failings. Now here's the thing about the subject of possession. Oftentimes it's attributed to individuals who display signs of mental illness and as a result are very prone to suggestion. And these same individuals can also be prone to an even more powerful suggestion that overrides the prevailing one. For example, you feel you are less than a whole person or angry because of burdens that have been placed upon you. But some will say what's actually happening is a third party is responsible for your aberrant behaviors, and you really bear no responsibility for them. These are often the people who go on to commit atrocities without a sense of accountability or even remorse. And religion also plays in because belief systems are a very powerful instrument used to guide people in a particular direction, whether that be good or bad. Michael Taylor was likely looking for a sense of belonging, and the church provided a sort of pseudo-family environment that he immersed himself in and came to internalize their principles of good and evil. And while most cultures embrace some form of exorcism, it's most commonly attributed to Catholicism. As far as exorcisms gone wrong, it's the perfect example of why the Catholic Church has such vigorous requirements to conduct one, which includes a full psychological evaluation. But sometimes the problem is people who want granted an exorcism by the Catholics now have a variety of other options, many who don't take into account the psychological factors that might be present and instead go on gut feelings and outdated religious dogma. The Michael Taylor case is one that should serve as a cautionary tale to those who blur the lines between mental illness and religious fixation. Perhaps there are demons inside of us all, but when you gaze too closely into the abyss, you might encounter something gazing back at you.